HOA Karen tries to have me arrested. Didn't know my dad is the sheriff. Kyle Matthews unpacked the last of his boxes in his new home, a quiet, picturesque house nestled in the heart of a peaceful suburban neighborhood. The move had been prompted by a job transfer, but as he stepped back and surveyed the well-maintained street, he couldn't help but smile. This was the kind of place he'd always dreamed of, peaceful, orderly, and serene. The air smelled of freshly mowed grass, the houses lined up in perfect symmetry, each lawn a vibrant green. It was the perfect retreat from the chaos of city life. He could already imagine weekend barbecues, morning jogs, and lazy afternoons on the porch. But as Kyle unpacked, he noticed the first signs of trouble, signs that would soon change everything. On his front door was a bright yellow envelope from the HOA. He opened it to find a lengthy list of rules and regulations, from lawn heights to acceptable paint colors. A few houses down, he spotted an older woman with a clipboard, watching him closely. He smiled, waving. She didn't wave back. As Kyle Matthews unpacked his boxes in his new house, he never imagined the biggest challenge he'd face would be Karen, the self-appointed queen of the HOA. Kyle spent his first Saturday in the new house working on his front yard, determined to put his personal touch on the place. He pulled weeds, trimmed the hedges, and planted a row of colorful wildflowers in the flower bed. It was a simple touch, nothing extravagant, just a way to make the place feel like home. The sun was shining, and the quiet of the neighborhood made him feel at peace. That's when he heard the crunch of gravel underfoot. Kyle looked up, squinting against the midday sun, to see a woman standing on his lawn. She was in her mid-50s, wearing a crisp blazer and holding a clipboard, her expression stern. "Are you the new resident?" she asked, her voice sharp. "Yeah, I'm Kyle Matthews," he said, standing up and brushing dirt off his hands. "Just settling in." She didn't introduce herself, but Kyle knew immediately who she was. Karen, the notorious HOA president. She stared at his garden with disdain. "You're in violation of the HOA guidelines," she said, her tone smug and self-righteous. "This wildflower garden is far too unkempt. You've got overgrowth in places, and it's completely out of compliance with our landscaping rules. I'm issuing a fine of $200 for the mess." Kyle blinked, stunned. A fine for flowers? Karen didn't even flinch. "Rules are rules, Mr. Matthews." Kyle walked into the HOA office, the faint smell of fresh paper and printer ink hanging in the air. Behind the front desk sat Sharon, the assistant, who greeted him with a polite but distant smile. Karen's office door was open, and he could already hear her voice from inside, sharp and authoritative. He wasn't surprised to see her there. After all, she practically lived in the office, ruling the neighborhood with an iron fist. "Mr. Matthews," Karen said, glancing up as Kyle stepped into her office. She didn't even rise from her chair. "I trust you've come to settle your fine?" "I'd like to discuss it first," Kyle said, trying to keep his voice even. "I don't think a fine for a flower bed is justified." Karen raised an eyebrow, her lips curling into a thin smile. "The rules are clear, Mr. Matthews. Your garden is in violation of HOA standards. You've been given a fine for it. We don't need to discuss it further." Kyle's jaw clenched. "I disagree. I'm asking for reconsideration." "Reconsideration?" Karen interrupted, her voice suddenly icy. "The HOA has spoken. Payment is due immediately, or further penalties will apply." Kyle's frustration bubbled up, but he kept it in check. "Karen, I'm not backing down. Not this time." She smirked, leaning back in her chair. "You'll learn quickly, Mr. Matthews. The HOA holds the power here, and I'm not afraid to use it." Kyle slammed the kitchen cabinet shut, the sound echoing through the quiet house. He paced back and forth, his hands running through his hair in frustration. The HOA fine was still fresh in his mind, the absurdity of it gnawing at him. He needed to talk to someone, and his dad, Sheriff Tom Matthews, was the only person who would understand. Tom was sitting at the kitchen table, his broad frame leaning back in his chair, a mug of coffee in his hands. His face was calm, but Kyle could tell from the way he was watching him that he was ready to listen. "Dad, this is ridiculous," Kyle muttered, slumping down across from him. "Karen's got it out for me. I moved into this neighborhood hoping for peace and quiet, and instead, I've got her breathing down my neck over my garden. She's threatening fines, even saying I'll get arrested if I don't comply with her rules." Tom's eyes narrowed, his expression hardening for a moment. He set the mug down with a soft thud. "Karen doesn't know who she's dealing with. You can't let people like her push you around, son. She's using her power to intimidate you. Don't let her get away with it." Kyle sighed. "But she's the HOA president, Dad. What can I do?" Tom's lips curled into a wry smile. "You've got more leverage than you think." Kyle sat in the back of the packed community center, his palms sweaty as he listened to Karen call the meeting to order. The room was filled with neighbors, some exchanging quiet whispers, others flipping through their copies of the HOA guidelines. Kyle knew this wasn't going to be a simple meeting. Karen had made it clear she was using this as a public spectacle to make an example of him. As the meeting progressed, Karen finally called out his name. "Kyle Matthews, please stand." Her voice echoed across the room, sharp and authoritative. "It has come to my attention that you are in violation of our HOA guidelines. Your wildflower garden is a clear breach of the landscaping code. We have given you multiple warnings, but you have ignored them. I'm issuing a fine of $1,000. The room fell silent. Eyes turned toward Kyle, some with sympathy, others with judgment. Kyle's heart pounded in his chest, but he stood up slowly, his voice steady but firm. "I'm not paying a fine for something that isn't a real violation," Kyle said, his words cutting through the tension. "The guidelines are vague, and there's no specific rule against the flowers I've planted. If Karen wants to fine me, she needs to prove a legitimate infraction. Otherwise, I'll see you in court." The crowd shifted, murmurs spreading. Karen's face flushed, but she didn't back down. Yet, the tension in the room was palpable. Kyle had just fired the first shot in what was quickly becoming a public battle. Kyle was in the middle of watering his front garden when he saw Karen approaching again, this time with a phone pressed to her ear. Her eyes locked onto him, and she gave him a tight, almost mocking smile. Kyle had been expecting this. She'd made it clear she wasn't done with him, but he wasn't prepared for what happened next. Minutes later, a squad car rolled up to the curb. 2 officers stepped out, their expressions unreadable. Kyle's stomach dropped. He stood up straight, wiping his hands on his jeans. But before he could say a word, Karen's voice rang out. "Officers," she said, her voice dripping with feigned concern. "This man is harassing me. He's been defying HOA rules, and now he's causing a disturbance. I'm afraid it's gone beyond a civil matter. I think it's time he learns some respect." Kyle shook his head, a mix of disbelief and frustration. "Harassment? Are you kidding me?" But Karen didn't back down. The officers exchanged glances and walked toward him. As they approached, Kyle felt a heavy, familiar presence behind him. He turned, and there, stepping out of the front door, was his dad, Sheriff Tom Matthews. The officer looked up, eyes widening as the sheriff stepped forward. "Dad," Kyle muttered under his breath, knowing this was about to get interesting. Sheriff Tom Matthews walked toward the officers with calm authority, his boots crunching on the gravel. The 2 officers stood a little straighter, but their eyes widened when they saw who was approaching. Karen's confident smirk faltered as she turned to face him. "Tom," she said, forcing a smile, "I'm afraid we have a bit of a situation here." Kyle stood silently, watching his father, knowing this was going to end in a way Karen hadn't anticipated. Sheriff Matthews didn't even acknowledge her as he spoke directly to the officers. "Let me clarify something," Sheriff Matthews said, his voice steady. "There's no disturbance here, and no harassment. This is a civil matter, a disagreement over landscaping. You've got no cause to be here, and I suggest you make that clear to Ms. Westbrook." The officers exchanged a brief look, their expressions hardening as they realized they'd been caught in the middle of a personal vendetta. Karen tried to interrupt, her voice rising. "This man," she began, But Sheriff Matthews cut her off with a sharp glance. Karen, you've made your complaint. The law doesn't support it, and neither does the sheriff's department. If you continue with this nonsense, I'll have to advise you to stop wasting law enforcement resources. Karen flushed, her face turning beet red. The officers muttered their apologies and started to walk away, their steps quickening. As they left, Kyle's heart swelled. His dad had just shut Karen down with a single word. Kyle realized, in that moment, how much power his father truly held in the community. Kyle walked into the HOA headquarters with a stack of documents under his arm. His mind focused. The air was thick with anticipation. He knew this meeting could change everything. As he entered the room, Karen was already sitting at the front, her arms crossed and a smug look on her face. Sharon, the assistant, gave him a polite nod as she shuffled papers on her desk. Mr. Matthews, Karen said, barely masking the annoyance in her voice. I'm assuming this is another complaint about your garden? Kyle didn't respond to her tone. He had a bigger goal in mind. He set the stack of papers down on the table, facing the board members, and addressed the room. I've come to file an official complaint against Karen's actions, specifically the way she's been enforcing HOA rules. As you can see, he gestured to the documents. There are clear inconsistencies. Neighbors in violation of the same landscaping codes haven't received fines, and in some cases, no action has been taken at all. The board members leaned forward, intrigued by his calm, methodical presentation. Kyle laid out examples from other residents, gardeners with wildflower beds just like his, but no fines. He even had emails and photos to back it up. As he spoke, Karen's face reddened. The room grew quieter, and whispers of doubt began to spread. Kyle's measured approach was starting to unravel her authority. The HOA board was listening, and Karen's grip on power was slipping. The courtroom was packed, a mix of curious neighbors, journalists, and community members who had all come to see the spectacle unfold. Kyle sat at the defendant's table, his palms slightly sweaty but his resolve firm. He wasn't just fighting for his garden anymore. He was fighting for the integrity of the entire neighborhood. Across from him, Karen sat with her arms crossed, her gaze icy and smug. The HOA board members flanked her, their faces stony, as though they were prepared for a quick win. Kyle glanced at the judge, an older man with glasses perched on the edge of his nose. The judge nodded at him, signaling that it was time to speak. Taking a deep breath, Kyle stood, holding up the evidence he'd spent weeks compiling. Photographs of other residents in clear violation of the same rules, emails, and testimonies. Your Honor, he began, his voice steady but growing stronger with each word. This isn't about a garden. This is about the abuse of power. Karen Westbrook has been selectively enforcing the HOA's rules, punishing certain residents while letting others off the hook. Karen stood up to interrupt, but the judge raised a hand. Kyle pressed on, his words like a hammer on the stone. The HOA is supposed to serve the community, not control it. And I won't stand by while one person uses it to bully the residents. The courtroom fell silent. The crowd was hanging on every word. Kyle had exposed the cracks in the HOA's system, and the final blow was about to land. The courtroom was silent as Judge Thompson sifted through the papers, his glasses perched on the tip of his nose. The tension in the air was palpable, every eye in the room fixed on him. Karen's smug expression had faded, replaced with a nervous edge as the judge cleared his throat. After carefully considering the evidence presented by both sides, Judge Thompson began, his voice calm but firm. It is clear that Ms. Westbrook's actions were not only arbitrary but a direct violation of the rights of Mr. Matthews and, by extension, the residents of this community. Karen's face flushed, but she remained silent as the judge continued. The HOA's enforcement of its rules has been inconsistent, and the actions taken against Mr. Matthews were an abuse of power. I hereby rule in favor of Mr. Matthews. The HOA is ordered to revise its enforcement policies to ensure fairness and consistency. Furthermore, an official apology must be issued to Mr. Matthews for the undue stress caused by these actions. A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. Then, as if on cue, The room erupted into applause. Kyle stood at the front, a quiet smile forming on his lips as he glanced at his father in the back, who gave him a proud nod. This wasn't just a victory over the HOA. It was a win for personal freedom, for standing up against injustice. And it was a reminder that sometimes one voice could change everything. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over Kyle's backyard, where laughter and the sizzling sound of the grill filled the air. Friends, family, and neighbors gathered around long picnic tables, plates piled high with food and cold drinks in hand. It was a celebration, not just of the victory over the HOA, but of a community that had come together to fight for what was right. Kyle stood near the grill, his dad, Sheriff Tom Matthews, beside him, flipping burgers while they chatted. The victory was still fresh, but the change was already undeniable. Karen had been removed from her position as HOA president, and the board had been overhauled, bringing in new leaders focused on fairness and transparency. The revised policies ensured that no one would be unfairly targeted again. Neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak up now walked freely around, their heads held higher. Conversations had shifted from complaints to ideas, with everyone feeling empowered to have a voice in how their community was governed. Kyle paused for a moment, watching the joyful scene around him. He realized that this victory wasn't just about winning a legal battle. It was about standing up for fairness, for his rights, and for the rights of everyone in the neighborhood. The community, once fractured and fearful, was now united and stronger than ever. And Kyle knew, with a sense of pride, that his fight had reshaped not just the HOA, but the future of the entire neighborhood.